Hello and welcome back to another Warlords of Draenor video. This time we're going to be covering a recent interview that was done with Zarhym and Celestalon on the Convert Raid podcast. Now basically I've listened to the podcast, as always, great show, big respect for those guys, but just for the sake of getting this information boiled down, I've kind of transcribed it all, and yeah, that's basically it. There won't be a great deal in the way of visual aids, so if you just want to play Warcraft or something like that while you listen, then that's probably the best way to experience this video. Alright, well, let's get into the information. So first of all, they had a little bit of a talk about perks, and they said that reward was lost when you automatically learned new spells, and that one of the things that perks do well is they bring back reward into the leveling experience, especially in levels 90 through 100, in such a way that you feel significantly more powerful, and the changes are large enough for you to really notice them. It also allows Blizzard to tweak some rotations without having to actually do a hard change on them. This basically means that players will be able to ease into the new changes that are going to come to the rotations, and yeah, perks are really just a nice soft way of introducing this. I think that's really good, and just on a side note, personal thing that I've noticed, the way that you automatically learn some major glyphs also has this effect for the lower levels, which is, in my opinion, rather welcome. Alright, so next they talked about Vengeance. And basically, as a team, they did not like how it changed things for tanks, because often it encouraged them to take more damage so that they could, well, deal more damage, and sometimes tanks were even beating DPS. And that was kind of annoying, because this, well, first of all, it annoyed DPS, but tanks trying to take more damage so that they could get higher DPS also annoyed the healers, because it didn't really encourage tanky gameplay. So basically what they've done is they've removed the offensive elements, they've rebranded it as Resolve, and basically it's just the defensive elements of Vengeance that should help out with active mitigation. Having a massive disparity in damage from Vengeance, from Vengeance in a really Vengeance-friendly situation, so for an example, when you're you're attacking the bats on Tortos, well, that in comparison to just a single target situation where you don't get maybe a lot of Vengeance, that was annoying from a tanking perspective because your DPS was all over the place. Once again, they didn't really like how that gameplay just felt, so it has been changed. I think overall these are pretty good, and to compensate for this, Celestalon noted that they have increased the baseline damage the tanks will do, so that overall they're still going to do quite a bit of damage, it'll just be a little bit more consistent and not tied to bad tanking behavior, which was one of the things that Vengeance did, unfortunately. Alright, so next, they talked about mana regen abilities. This has definitely been something of it's been a bit of a concern for healers. Basically, things like Innervate are being removed because they didn't offer good gameplay. Basically, with Innervate, what you would do is you would use it 10 seconds into the fight, and then every time after that it came off cooldown. That wasn't really interesting or engaging, it was just another button to hit every X amount of time. And basically they think that it's better just to remove that and then rebalance the cost of healing spells so that there was no net difference, just that one bit of complexity which didn't, in their opinion, add much fun has been removed. So that's definitely something to note there. Basically, when Blizzard say they're removing something like Innervate, it doesn't mean you're going to go back to the Cataclysm days of healing when you're being, out of mana all the time. They're going to rebalance everything around that change, and that's what they've said. Then he also said that they are looking, and this is very interesting to me actually, they are looking at a potential active mana regen, though there is really nothing to announce. What could that be? No idea, they haven't announced it, but active mana regen does sound like a more interesting way to do healing, so that's definitely quite nice. Alright, so next, they said that stackable raid utility blurred the lines between roles too much. Often you'd have a scary part of a fight, and instead of that being handled by the healer, as it should be for their job, well, it was actually being handled by DPS characters or perhaps tanks using a raid-wide damage mitigation cooldown. They feel like this just blurred the lines, and it took away some of the uniqueness to what healers were supposed to do, so that's why they've toned down much of the stackable raid utility that is basically being put into the game. So I think that's definitely fair enough, and perhaps it's going to give healers a little bit more on their plate to think about, and that could lead to more just engaging healer gameplay. Okay, so next they said that the largest class redesign for anyone is on Mistweavers. Basically they're happy with the other monk specs, but Mistweavers in general, they're just not too happy with how they turned out in Mists. Now what's going to happen is that they're going to value from stats a little bit differently, especially in regards to how useful Spirit is. But yeah, there'll be more details on that at a later date. And then just in general, he said that they want to diversify specs, with Hunters actually being the worst defender. The core problem for Hunters is that the core rotations were actually very similar, with many of the buttons basically being the same in terms of their gameplay value. So for an example, now we will be spamming Arcane Shot and Survival as a focus dump, but then we will be using the longer and more punchy Aimed Shot as a focus dump when we are in Marksmanship. That means that the classes are just going to, or the specs even, are just going to feel a little bit different. Honestly, from Hunter spec to Hunter spec, they play largely the same, and any abilities that are different are not particularly, well, in terms of gameplay, different from their near equivalents in other specs. I know that sounds like a really kind of hazy, weird sentence, but you know what I mean. Basically, there just wasn't enough variation. So it's nice that they will be doing that for Hunters, and I'd imagine they're going to be doing it for some other DPS specs that have been having similar problems. Alright, so next they said that they want tanking to be a little bit more active, though they are tired of the kind of swap at X amount of stacks mechanics, especially in Throne of Thunder where they feel it was just a little bit too prevalent. Basically, the job of the off-tank was often just to stand there and sort of do DPS, which wasn't really what tanks are there for. So basically they're thinking of doing a little bit of the Wrath model. Now, back in Wrath of the Lich King, they used this, it was kind of like a Saber Lash style of a tank mechanic, where basically the boss would replicate white damage to the off-tank, and they may actually use this a little bit more, and the reason is that active mitigation mechanics will mean that there is still gameplay there for the off-tank, which will solve one of the main problems of Wrath tanking, in which the off-tank could basically be AFK. That'll no longer be the case. Overall, though, that sounds like a pretty good way to balance things out, and yeah, there was definitely a problem where every single boss was just, swapping a certain amount of stacks. It's definitely, I think, a bit of an inherent problem with tanking, though, because just how do you make that interesting? I think active mitigation is definitely a large step towards that, but there's always more work that can be done to make it better. Okay, so next, they talked a little bit about healing in relation to the Cataclysm model. Essentially, they want to take the good, decisive gameplay value from Cataclysm, but ensure that the constant mana problem is, well, no longer a thing. And they want you to make decisions and then try to take efficiency into account, but in order to prevent the Cataclysm-style problems, baseline mana regeneration is a lot higher than it was in that stage of the game, which should solve the out-of-mana problem. Another thing they said is that they do want increasing amounts of spirit to allow you to cast better heals more often as the expansion goes on, and the point is just that they're trying to make healing a little bit less one-dimensional overall. Now, I'm not too sure exactly what that means in terms of, by the very last patch, are we just sitting there spamming our most powerful heals? Well, that would go completely against the philosophies that they've been talking about with healing, so I'm guessing you may get a little bit more leeway as time goes on, but overall, the healing gameplay experience should feel rather similar. I think. That would definitely make sense. Anyway, so he also said that you can currently with the changes that are going on, if you can heal X bit of content, then in the future you'll still be able to heal that. A lot of people are worried that they're having massive nerfs or anything like that. You're not having a nerf. Everyone's being changed. There's no nerf. That's essentially the lowdown on it all. And he also said that encounter design will be completely balanced around this. So bosses like Thok the Bloodthirsty and Duramu wouldn't exist in their current forms with a healing system like that. They also know that it feels really terrible when people die faster than you can be reasonably expected to react. That's been a little bit of a problem where a lot of healing is just turned into lots of burst damage and then prioritizing heavily reaction times. They are definitely trying to get away from that style of gameplay, and I think that's actually a very good move. Okay, so with all that said, let's move into some class-specific things. And first of all, we have Death Knights. So they are thinking of bringing Army of the Dead back for everyone, and they're going to be making it an instant cast, which causes the ghouls to spawn over 6 seconds. This is actually very nice for pre-potting, so overall, quite a good move. Then also, the active mitigation of Blood DKs was basically just Deathstrike, and as it turned out, Deathstrike was one of the things that gave them the main idea for active mitigation. But anyway, they are planning on updating this toolkit. RuneTap will play a larger sort of role in the whole active mitigation toolkit of Blood DKs, and it will be a very hefty absorb that you can use before you're about to take a lot of damage. Also, they're going to be adding a Draenor perk, which is going to give you small shields from your rune strikes. So overall, a lot of your offensive abilities and things like that will have active mitigation elements to them, which I think is very, very, very cool. It should make tanking a little bit more fun. Then he also said that they want to keep dual wielding a frost thing because thematically they think it fits a little bit better. And then finally, on the topic of Death Knights, he said that they are thinking of bringing the power up on some of the lesser used rune forges. So I guess that's interesting. I'm not really, I've not played Death Knight at max level basically for a long time, so I'm not too sure on the exact landscape of things. But overall, those changes sound pretty decent, and I'm glad that everyone is going to get Army of the Dead, because I think it's a very iconic spell. Alright, so next, for Druids, he said that the amount of button bloat that Symbiosis brings is not really worth it's just not worth it, essentially. The spell's cool, yes, but it's confusing, it's too many buttons, blah blah blah, and that's why they've decided to, overall, just cut the ability. And they think it's just for the overall good of how the class plays, and also just in terms of balance, that's just what they want. So I guess fair enough. And then also he said that level 90 druids have got a lot of changes. Basically they want them to assist you in doing an off-roll job, and then if you are, say, in restoration spec, just give you flat out more healing. They don't think that it necessarily needs to increase your main throughput. Right now, you end up healing via these talents so that you can do more damage, rather than using those hybrid talents as more of a utility thing than a throughput thing. I guess that's kind of interesting, but I'm not particularly sure why as a Feral Druid I'd be too interested in using healing in a raid scenario. I actually like how it plays at the minute, where you can use Healing Touch with, I think it's Path of Cenarius, to get yourself a little bit of a DPS boost. I actually think that plays out pretty well in terms of how it feels, so I'd hope that that gameplay would be preserved, but it doesn't sound like it, so perhaps a little bit sad to hear that, but of course this is only the very first wave of changes, and there will be many more to come in the future. Okay, so next for Hunters. He said that BM is very well kitted out, and overall they're happy enough with the spec, but he did say that MM and SV felt very similar. Marksmanship is going to have major changes. Basically, they want it to be the large hit and higher cast time big nuke hunter spec, whereas Survival will be the daughter, and then BM will be the pet-based class. I think that's a pretty good way of doing things. All three of those styles are very different from each other, and they also seemingly will lend themselves to different situations where perhaps MM will be the single target spec, then SV will be very good at multi-target, and maybe BM will just be kind of okay at both, or, whatever. It depends. We still need to wait and see how it all plays out. Still though, very interesting stuff, and personally just as a hunter, I'm glad that they're making these changes. He also mentioned that just in terms of the ability sort of pruning in general, hunters were one of the worst classes in terms of just having near duplicate spells with either specs, and it just overall meant that some hunter specs were just too similar, and it's good that they've removed that and fixed things up a little bit. Alright, so next we have the topic of mages. So essentially the prismatic crystal that you'll be able to make will actually be automatically targeted for you, and then all damage you do to that will be done to surrounding enemies, but amplified. They are aware of the usability concerns when it comes to target switching, though. Yeah, this prismatic crystal thing sounds kind of interesting. Basically, you summon a crystal, then you DPS the crystal, and any damage done to the crystal will be amplified onto other enemies around the crystal. That sounds really cool, but I think those usability concerns are very valid in terms of target switching, and I don't know if how that works in terms of any dots that you may have as a mage, but it's certainly something to be that they should take into consideration. Still though, it does seem like a very cool thing in essence. Next, he said the Brain Freeze will no longer make Frostfire Bolt an instant, though it will still make it count as frost damage, and then of course deal more just raw damage. So I think that's fair enough, and once again, they are just trying to tone down the amount of instants because they want to make movement matter a little bit more in terms of how much of a gameplay decision movement is. And then finally, on the topic of mages, he addressed the concern that the actual playstyle of fire changes a little bit with gear scaling. So first of all, he said that the cooldown on Inferno Blast does help to put a little bit of on a cap of how the scaling goes, but they are looking at doing a few different things, like breaking up the baseline amount of crit that you have at low levels of critical strike, which means that I think it's Fireball or Fire Blast, one of the two anyway, and the kind of interaction between that and your various other elements of your class will just be a little bit more smoothed out so that the actual core gameplay shouldn't really change as you gear up. It should just feel maybe a bit more snappy or, more damaging, etc. Then also, as you don't crit with a fireball, your chance of critting with a fireball will increase. So once again, this will just level things out. It will still be worse, I'd imagine, than having a higher crit chance, but it should, of course, help out in that regard. Alright, so next we have monks. And in terms of monks, he said that fist weaving is intended to be a split between DPS and healing, about 50-50. It's basically for when you don't need as much healing, so the monk healer can then go and help with DPS. If you're not aware, by the way, they are adding a new monk stance for fist weaving, which will specifically do that. Alright, so next, he said that Renewing Mist and Expel Harm will give a lot of chi generation, but Surging Mist will actually be one of the kind of main chi generators for monks, especially as you get more spirit. Right now, though, they understand how the initial reception has been, and that's especially because Surging Mist isn't particularly good at the minute, but they will be improving that for Warlords of Draenor. Next, he said that Rushing Jade Wind will not work with Spinning Crane Kick. So that's probably a thing that the monks will understand. And then finally, this is very cool, he said that Touch of Death will still have its 1.5 minute cooldown, but it will now just operate in execute range and deal a large chunk of damage. This means that it's essentially the same in PvE against just random mobs, but it's now going to be useful against bosses. So you might have this giant hit for well, maybe in current Siege of Orgrimmar numbers, maybe 1 million damage or 2 million damage, whatever, but you'll only get that once every 1.5 minutes. I think that's fair enough, and it does keep the flavor of Touch of Death just being one big, extremely painful thing. Okay, so next, he talks about Paladins. He said that right now Ret is in a good place in terms of design, but they are a little bit weak in terms of numbers, and though they have not yet done their balance and tuning passes, of course there will be multiple balance and tuning passes, so just stay tuned on that, but don't worry, Ret is not going to be gimped in terms of numbers for any particular reason in the expansion. So then next he said that the healing side of Execution Sentence is going to be a little bit more useful. Stay of Execution will actually give you a large bit of instant healing and then apply a hot which will slowly ramp down, so it's essentially the opposite. I think that's pretty cool actually from the very limited experience that I have of healing on a Paladin. And then finally he said that Holy will actually gain from Multi-Strike. What it will do is, I don't know exactly, but basically it will amplify some heals on the Paladin. I'll bring more information about that to you once we kind of find out exactly, but it sounds interesting, and once again, they're just going to make sure that even something like Multi-Strike, which does sound like a very DPS-focused secondary stat, will actually be useful to a Paladin. So I think that's pretty nifty. Alright, next let's talk about rogues. So, like hunters, rogues need a little bit more distinction between the specs, but it's not really as bad as hunters. So to do that, they are going to be limiting some abilities to certain specs, and maybe removing some abilities, basically the usual, and if you've read the patch notes, you know at least what their first kind of attempt at that has been. And then also he said that the laxing of facing requirements is a big help for playability, but they still want you to ideally move behind the boss because that will avoid the 3% parry chance. So fair enough, I think that facing requirements on some abilities can be a little bit annoying, especially when they're bread and butter, and I'm really okay with that change. Also just coming from the perspective of someone who's been recently playing a Feral Druid, once again, I think that's pretty cool. Then he said that he recognizes that the number of poisons has been a little bit low, so I'd imagine that they're going to try to up that just a tad in the future. Okay, so next they talked about shamans, and basically the Echo of the Elements redesign is because they wanted AoE for enhancement shamans that has a decent bit of ramp up time, but once it does ramp up is very powerful. And, well, unfortunately, that's the only thing that they really had to say about shamans. I think they mentioned two-handed enhancement and how that's not going to be a thing, but they do understand how it's kind of cool. So, yeah, that's basically the lowdown for shamans. And then next, for warlocks, they said the gateways are changing, and they were doing really strong this expansion, so they're going to be lowering their range and increasing their cooldown up to being able to be used once every 90 seconds. So there's that. Then for the warriors, they said that Berserker Rage and Berserker Stance may see some more changes, and I think they mentioned that they're going to be cleaning up the arms rotation a little bit. Though that is essentially it. We just have one or two little tidbits that were said at the end of the show. So in terms of guilds, there are no more plans for guild rewards or anything like that, and the same goes for more guild crests. He also said that readiness will affect a lot of abilities, but the current tooltips that you may see coming from the Warlords of Draenor Alpha are actually placeholder and are not correct. They often talk about abilities which have actually been removed from the game, so don't really pay too much heed to that. Then finally, what they said is that there will be a professions blog coming up on lowdown state, and that finally there was no BlizzCon information to go around. Well, it was more the guys in CTR asked Zarhym, or Zarhym even if there was any information, and he said that he basically couldn't say, which is fair enough. So that's basically it for the interview. It was a pretty good show actually, so if you want to go and check out Convert to Raid, be sure to do that. Just, Google Convert to Raid, they will appear. They're like one of the biggest World of Warcraft podcasts. And yeah, that's essentially it for now. Be sure to stay tuned to the channel and subscribe for all the latest Warlords of Draenor information. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.